Great. So this is our February webinar, and we're going to tackle the big topic of consistency in the roastery. So I'm really excited to have my guests here with us today. I'll be the host, the moderator, maybe a little bit of a participant moderator. I'm Marcus with Cropster, and I run our education programming, but have about 20 years in coffee, working with roasting companies and producers and retailers way back in the day. But this is what I live and breathe. And I'm really excited to have this conversation, and I think to learn from both Steve and Johannes. So Steve, can you give us just a little introduction about yourself, your experience, and also the company Linnea, where you're currently find yourself?
Sure, I'm Steve Lee. I am the COO of Linea Cafe, which is a small micro roastery in San Francisco, California. I've been in coffee for like 26 years, I think. Started out at Pete's as a barista, worked my up to the training department and was writing some education and opening new stores. Moved on to open Intelligentsia Los Angeles and set up the roasting and QC programs there. Kind of bounced around and did some consulting, worked in Korea, just a little bit of everything. And so now I find myself happily back in San Francisco after being away for about 20 years. So I grew up here, and it's nice to be back.
It's good to have you back. Yeah, and our paths first crossed many years ago at Pete's, I think.
Right.
And, when I was up in Portland and managing stores and actually thinking about consistency and QC kind of at the retail level and working closely with other folks in the training department. So it's always nice to be part of that cohort that came through Pete's like 20 years ago. And
there's a lot of Pete's folks out there.
Yeah, it's like you can't throw a stone in the Bay Area without hitting somebody like running a company, running a coffee program, doing the work that I do. It's awesome. So thanks for joining. It's good to have you, Steve.
Yeah, thank you.
And Johannes, I'm so glad to have you here from Roastery. And we don't know each other quite as well, but I've loved like following your comments, and as a beta tester for some Cropster features, your perspective is awesome as well. So I'd love to just hear a little bit more about your background and what brings you here today.
Yeah, hi, I'm Johannes. Thanks for having me. I'm the new guy, maybe. I've been working at Roastery for 6 years now, and also working in coffee business for 6 years now. And for me, it all started as a job as a barista besides university. And after I finished university, I thought I could stay in coffee business because it was always like a dream for me. And at first I thought I will do it for maybe a year or two, and now it's 6 years and still love it. And I worked my way up from a barista to quality control, working at the roastery, giving courses, also SCA courses. And yeah, I'm in charge for quality control, sample roasting, roast profile development. And I think I'm a Cropster beta tester for 2 years now. And yeah, that's lots of fun. You always get to see the new stuff, get to try and test the new stuff and give my feedback. And yeah, that's what I love.
That's awesome. Yeah, and Steve was like a Cropster beta tester back in the very early days, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, like, one of the first Cropster, before there was like RI or anything. It was fun.
And Johannes, you say like you're the new guy or the young guy, but I look to like everything that you're thinking about and learning and the questions you have. I think that I probably have a ton to learn from you. So thanks for joining.
Thank you.
And our agenda today. So we will, sort of have a discussion amongst ourselves. There's a presentation that goes along with it, more just as talking points and some nice photos of best practices and things. And we want there to be time for Q&A. So I really want this to all of you that are attending. Please don't be shy about using the Q&A feature or the chat feature to chime in, share your perspective. If I can fold it into the discussion as it's happening, I will. If not, we do have time at the end for some Q&A. But sort of generally what we're going to cover today are the topics of, the importance of consistency and the challenges. We'll talk about some techniques or best practices for achieving and maintaining consistency. But then really, I want the bulk of this to be just talking with Steve and Johannes about sort of the practical applications, because we can talk all day long about best practices, but I think the reality of running a roasting company and time being a limited resource, there's a pragmatic approach to all of this stuff too. So hopefully that becomes a good takeaway for everybody that's watching. And let's just sort of start with this question, from the perspective of a roasting department, from a coffee buyer, from a operations executive. Like what the heck is consistency from the perspective of coffee and the roasted product? Johannes, how do you think about this question?
For me, it's a hard question to answer, because consistency for me is always, it's like an unreachable goal. You don't always get perfect, consistent coffee or taste or anything. It's always trying to reach the perfect goal, the perfect coffee, the perfect roast, the perfect roast curve. But you always have to keep in mind that you might not get to the point where everything is perfectly consistent. So for me, consistency is that you have always maybe the same coffee, and trying to keep everything in an order. Like your quality control, you always have to do the quality control. You always have to do the same stuff. You have to trying to deal with all those parameters like humidity, like temperature, storing temperature, etc., and always trying to keep it at the best or the most perfect level possible.
Right. Yeah, I think I like that idea. I mean, it's one of the talking points here, right, is consistency and illusion, and you sort of speak to that a little bit. It's something that we're always chasing, but maybe from the perspective that the three of us have, it's something that's rarely attained. And Steve, how about your thoughts on this? I know when we were kind of preparing for this, you mentioned like standard operating procedures, but I'm sure I'd love to hear that angle on this question.
Right, consistency. I mean, like Johannes said, it's elusive, but and it's a balancing act between trying to get the perfect roast or whatnot. And ideally, like, you should, it's a customer thing, and it's a quality control versus quality assurance thing as well, right? It's like, ideally you should have profiled your coffee, and you have like the profile that you're ideal with, and consistency at that point becomes maintaining that profile, like creating, certain attributes and trying to nail those attributes and those intensity levels on a repeated basis. And I think things like data logging or, just managing those elements really helps to maintain some version of consistency. But yeah, is it an illusion as things change? Like you can't produce the same roast every time and actually expect it to be consistent, right? Because like Johannes mentioned, like there's just stuff that happens, like moisture content changes as it stays in your warehouse. We're lucky to live in California, Marcus, you and I, but for people that don't, like, the temperature change in the warehouse is drastic from winter to summer, the humidity level. So that's totally going to change, what you're doing. And, within that consistency level, having SOPs in place, right, is important, so that you have the same thing that you do all the time to measure the consistency, and then having quality control, quality assurance in place to make sure that those standard operating procedures are still working for you. I think that's sort of like, and then trying to juggle all of that, and balance it all to make it where we still need to move coffee out of the door at the same time.
Right. Yeah, no, I love that. And and I think, roasters love to talk about profiles, but we also sort of don't have an agreement about what a profile is, right?
Right.
And, it is one element of a standard operating procedure, right? And I think it's like, on the one hand, a profile is just, does this coffee taste the way I'd expect it to, right?
Right. Especially as you scale and you grow, though, consistency, I think, becomes more important, right? There was a story I was telling you guys when we started on, when I started doing, I joined another company. I was really wanting to change, as younger, like, I want to change the world. I want to change the way this thing goes. It's like, this is the roast profile I want. Like, I totally want to change the buying practices and everything else. But at the same time, one of my friends was working for a larger coffee company, and he had just started there too. And we're talking about consistency or how to do this. And he just got this thing where, he had bought some coffee and he had gone through an old batch of coffee and he was moving on to new crop. And the QC department to him said, yeah, we noticed there's something different about this blend. And he's like, yeah, we finally got rid of that past crop coffee. It's tasting like 2 or 3 points better. It's amazing, right? And like, yeah, the quality control department said, yeah, we don't recognize better. We recognize different. And this coffee is different. So now we have a problem. And it totally made me backtrack. Oh, wait a second. Like, I got this story right as I was planning to make these just sweeping changes, and, thought, wait, that's a really good point there. Let's make these changes, but make these changes like long-term goals. So, from a consistency level, our customers, I don't want to alienate the customer, right? I just want to make it a better product, but somehow have this illusion of consistency so that I'm changing it so that it's better. So like a year from now or 6 months from now, this is like what I want. But as far as the customer is concerned, like, everything's great. Everything's been great all along. You don't want to disillusion or disenfranchise the brand. You just want to achieve your goals. And I think that's another sort of version of thinking about consistency on a different level.
Yeah, 100%. I think, to me, like, why does it matter? It's like, it maybe sounds like the nuclear option to describe it this way, but customers want consistency probably more than they want delicious, which,
right.
That's like the voice of the customer from this QC department saying, we don't recognize better, we recognize different.
For better or worse, that's why fast food works so well, right? It's like, whether you like it or not, it's there. And that is sort of like, there's a comfort level about consistency, right? And I think that's the thing. And, driving comfort and meeting people and meeting your customers' needs. I think from a business operator perspective, you can be super egomaniacal about it. And it's like, I only want to roast X and I just want to produce coffees that this or that or the other. But at some point in time when, you still need to sell the coffee, and you still need to, we're still in the hospitality business. We're still customer focused, and we still need to get feedback and understand and listen to our customers. I mean, and you also create your own customers. There's customers that we want and customers we don't want. And we'd like more of the, former and not the latter, but it's still a business.
Yeah, absolutely. And it speaks, you mentioned fast food, but we could all think of major coffee chains that fit in the same kind of bucket, right? And I think it's absolutely critical to that. And, it's some of the challenges which we've already discussed with this. Steve, you had the great example of just like coffee ages, right? And I had a very similar experience with a company where I was working as a trainer and as like a retail consultant for their wholesale clients. Same thing, when the major component of the blend, when the fresh crop coffee would come in, we weren't big enough to have a formal QC department, but new crop coffee comes in. And if we just switched from old crop to new crop, which we all wanted to do because like this house blend, this espresso blend would shine, but all of these wholesale accounts, all of these like drive-through cafes and mom and pop bakeries and small town retailers would be like, why does the coffee taste so different? So we had to have an approach of weaving in the old coffee with the new, right? Like bring in 20% of the new coffee for a couple of weeks, go to 50-50, finally you're only using 20% of the old until it finally runs out. So it was taking this gradual approach. Yeah, absolutely. But what are
Your
some
operation, the size of your operation matters too, right? Because if you're small enough, you don't do wholesale and you just have your own cafe, and then, you know, there's still issues and there's still challenges, but then I think it becomes a little bit more simple where you can just have a communication like, hey, we got new crop coffee and the espresso is going to be different. Like you can kind of control your dial in, you can control and like, you know, even do a rollout and talk about these are the new tasting notes or these are the new parameters, and we can talk to our guests about it. It was easier to do that when people could come in your cafe and you can engage with them slightly better than over a window. But, you know, those, again, there's just the challenges of scale with consistency. And, you know, there are positives for being huge and there are positives for being not huge.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And Johannes, how about what are some of the challenges that you face with from this perspective with Roastetrommel and your own cafes and other business? And
I think the biggest challenges for us at the moment are the ambient conditions. As we live in south of Germany, we have lots of rain at the moment, and today maybe we have 5 degrees Celsius. Don't know what that's in Fahrenheit, but it's quite cold. And maybe the next day we have, maybe. And next day we have sunshine, maybe 10 degrees more, and the temperature is always going up and down in Germany. And I think that's the biggest challenges we have, to keep the storage at a certain temperature, keep the humidity at a certain temperature. That's one of our biggest challenges, and we trying to control all those conditions. Like we have an AC at the warehouse, we have a heater at the warehouse, we have a machine that controls the humidity at the warehouse. So we are trying to keep it at a certain level all year round.
Right.
That's all we can do, trying to control them as good as we can.
Right.
But also,
And just to kind of take a little bit of a step back, right? And like these things matter, right? Because the rate at which your green coffee ages can be impacted, but also like the temperature of the coffee as you load it in the roaster, right? And the inlet air temperature coming into the roaster, or the ambient humidity, right? That all affects the way you might have like the most perfect profile, but it becomes really hard to follow that if your coffee beans are, you know, a few degrees Celsius hotter or cooler than when you first roasted that, or if the room temperature is significantly different. You have to be prepared to accommodate.
Right, if you're roasting in the Midwest in the summer and it takes you 6 minutes to cool coffee because it's ridiculously hot and humid in the warehouse, like that's, you're not using the same profile, or I hope you're not, or, you know.
100%. Yeah, and you know, and when I think about these things, I remember a really great roaster that I worked with once. She had inherited the roasting program at a pretty important regional company, and you know, she stepped into this, and they have big temperature swings where they're located. But she stepped in and she shared all these profiles with me in Cropster, and there were like 4 airflow changes and like 15 gas changes for some of these coffees, which might be appropriate, but it was really hard to stay on top of that, like from winter to summer and things. So one of the first things that we did was we were just like, well, let's see, can we simplify this, right? Can we like get rid of all these air changes, maybe make one? Can we, and they like had a fairly nice older Probot where like 1 air change and 4 or 5 gas changes should be totally adequate. And just to make it much easier to be consistent with ambient conditions, and as she brought on like more junior roasters, it's tough, right? But
that's a good point, Marcus. Like, challenge of consistency is fussiness is often a challenge of consistency. Is like, are your profiles easy enough to follow? Are your protocols easy enough to be consistent about, right? That's a really good point.
And I think like from the barista perspective, right, we all like baristas recognize that pretty quick. It's like you might have a pour over recipe that you have to babysit for 3.5 minutes with like drip by drip by drip. Well, that's great. But you know what, if I can simplify that and have like 3 pours and kind of a soak, like great, because you know what, 15 people need to be able to reproduce that, not just the one nerd behind the scenes. Yeah, just to Johannes's point, I wanted to talk a little bit about just the ambient conditions, right? And Cropster is hyper aware of that and tries to address that with our ambient sensor, just a small internet connected sensor that you can put in your warehouse for green coffee and your roasting room, even in your packaging and production room, where you can track and sort of have a target range for temperature, humidity, pressure. And it's just the kind of thing, like even just as you open your Cropster account at the beginning of a roasting day, or like after a lunch break, being able to sort of see where things are falling compared to when you set the reference can be a huge benefit to my mind. And Johannes, you were just speaking to this, so it's like I prompt you to pitch Cropster ambient sensors in this session, but I promise I didn't. And right, I mean, and I think, the other challenges to consistency, I think, right? I mean, we talked about blend components already, but when I look at something like the cupping table as a consistency test, this automatically speaks to a challenge, right? Because we might be cupping coffees because it's efficient, it's what we're comfortable with, but that's not how any customers are drinking coffee, right? It's not how it's being handled downstream. So I think one of the challenges is designing a program to assess consistency that accounts for multiple brew methods and skill levels.
And again, like to your point, and one that's sort of not fussy, right? I mean, quality control, we all cup for different reasons. It's not a purchase cupping. Like we're not evaluating this coffee and scrutinizing it to a way, like we've already purchased this coffee. We just need to figure out what to do with it. So I think, again, making the easiest non-fussy, one of the great ways is just figure out the profile or the attributes to that profile or that coffee, and making sure that, you're hitting the correct, all of those attributes exist. They're at the correct intensity levels, and it's a pass fail from that standpoint. I think, it's just streamlining those operations and those procedures to make it where it's repeatable, it's doable. It's like if you're busy in the roasting works, that you could do it every day. You don't want to make a procedure so difficult that like roasters or people it's a drag to perform it. So you want to make it where you're able to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, and I think that just does sort of beg a good question. We'll get more deeply into QC in just a minute, but like, do you cup every batch every day? Or do you have some standard operating procedures that help you pull representative samples and red flag things when they go wrong, right?
Yeah.
What
I mean,
are
that's
what are the
what we do.
Yeah.
Yeah, what we do is we cup every Monday. And if we don't have any coffee that we are going to purchase, like a sample roast or something, we just do production cuppings. And I think we just trying to see if taste is changing, maybe if taste is changing to a little bit better taste. But we are always trying to also see if anything got wrong, or maybe if we have to adjust the roast profile. We're always trying to improve. We're always trying to change the parameters a little bit, to keep the coffee on a certain quality level or on a certain taste level.
Yeah, I mean, I love what you said, right? It's about, does the coffee taste the same, right? Because that's what your customers are drinking, and the curves could look different. You might have to roast a half batch versus a full batch at some point, right? And having the tools to help you do that, but right? It's like, it's just, what is a profile? It's like, well, maybe it starts with how does it taste, but then there's some like meta factors like weight loss percent or roast color. And then there's the more granular things like what was my development time or my roast time, or like, thanks for sharing all of these curves of the same profile, Johannes, right? That shows where there's some deviation, but boy, in all told, it certainly looks consistent from my perspective, not knowing the coffee, the system.
That was a coffee from Guatemala. I think. And it's a very, very small farm with it's just a small family doing their own stuff. It's not a big company. So that was a challenge for us to get consistent green coffee. It's the third year we are buying from them. Besides that, we are trying to get consistent roast curves, and they might look good, but they're all a little bit different. Some have maybe a little flick at the end. And we are always trying to cup them and taste them, and trying to decide if that had an impact on the taste, or maybe if the turning point is a few degrees higher than normally, or if that has something to do with the taste or does affect the taste. So we are trying to consistently cup them and adjust the roast curve maybe a little bit.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I love the way that you think through that, right? And it's kind of what separates often like great roasters from maybe less great roasters. It's this curiosity, and it's this like willingness just to realize that ultimately it's the cup that what answers these questions, but using the data kind of as a learning tool, and being able to like look at profiles and say, wow, how does that sort of light blue profile with the hotter turning temperature, faster time to yellow, and a little bit earlier first crack, right? How does that appear different on the table?
That's what we are curious about. I mean, Roestromel, I think we are here for 12 years now, or we are in the 12th year. So that's long for the south of Germany. We have been in specialty coffee, roastery that has been here very early. But we are still trying to understand roast curves and how those different shapes maybe affect the cup profile or the taste of the coffee. And that's what I'm interested in. If a different turning point temperature, like 5 degrees higher or lower, what does that to my cup? And that's interesting for me. That's why we cup so much. But also we are trying to understand if it changes anything for the customer. Mm-hmm. Are they able to taste that little change? Maybe. I mean, often we can taste the change because we have two different roast profiles next to each other. But the customers normally, they don't have different roast profiles and try them or drink them next to each other. So we have to understand if small changes make a big difference or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And Steve, like when you're sort of thinking of consistency and quality from the perspective, like how often do you look back at roast profiles, or, Cropster has the ability to set like roast goals and kind of report for those roasts that are outside of spec. Is that like, does it kind of start there for you, or is that something you would just go back to and analyze after tasting something?
Those are super meaningful, I think, again, in some of the busier facilities that I've worked at, especially the goals are super meaningful because it just, again, it sets some standardized parameters. And then this is sort of like, if it's a nuts day, I definitely should QC these coffees, before they go out. So it's definitely like red flags. And then I would usually look at the profiles after cupping, especially if there's any deviation or variance, or like if I'm noticing things drifting or swinging, like almost like what Johannes says, like, do I need to adjust the profile because I'm noticing that the profile isn't really meeting the needs of the coffee anymore? Yeah. Or this coffee is significantly better. What happened? Is this like, did you screw up, but you accidentally didn't screw up, and this profile is actually just the better one? Is this the happy accident that everyone's been waiting for? Yeah. There's so much stuff to just still interpret and, learn about coffee, and reading the data, utilizing the data. I love that I love the curiosity aspect of like what he's doing. And I also love that you're utilizing experiential, first-handed sort of data. It's not like, oh, there's a flick, therefore it's going to be some assumption. Like, oh, the turning points, like people look at the graph and are like, dude, your turning point's like 5 degrees too high. Like this coffee is going to taste ashy. You're like, why would you say that if you haven't tasted the coffee? Like, let's taste the coffee and see if we have something to learn. And then maybe this is a fluke, but then maybe we can gather enough data to make a stronger hypothesis. And then let's then test this hypothesis to make it more of a reality and something more concrete that me in my roasting works can say like, no, this now becomes a standard protocol in my roasting works because I've found that this works better.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. I love that perspective. I think it's got to come down to curiosity and tasting it and using the data to inform what you're doing. It's like, right, people don't taste a curve, they taste the coffee. And sometimes an ugly curve is that happy accident.
Yeah.
Yep.
Honestly, I feel that's what the profile curve. So like before when I was talking to Norbert, I don't know, like 12 years ago or something, and there was just the data logger and there was no profile curve. I think honestly, like the profile curve or the reference curve, the thing that it excels at to me is it excels at piquing one's curiosity in to know, like, everyone knows what happens when you color inside the lines, but what happens when you color outside the lines? But then as you're roasting, sometimes it's hard to know how far outside that line you're coloring. So like the profile just superimposed on top of it allows you to, color outside the lines and see that difference in real time. And then you can cup it and see if there is any difference that's recognizable. And I think the other thing that what Johannes says that is, to circle back to consistency is it a meaningful difference, right? Like, I think that's the other thing. What's your threshold and is it a meaningful difference? If your customers don't notice, is that good or bad? Or is it, there's no right answer, right? And everyone has their own version of the right answer, but like, what is the threshold of consistency? Is it like, anyone can notice this is way off base, or is it like I notice because I cup this stuff every day and like I'm super in tune with this, or is it like the baristas notice, or like who's your target that needs to notice for this to say that there's an issue with consistency?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's part of the illusion of it, right? And I once had a client where they sent me coffees from like giant roasting companies, a couple of them from different plants where they're roasting in different parts of North America. And it was great to be able to taste like Starbucks Pike Place from multiple roasting plants on very similar production days and see like just how, from like my perspective as like a professional taster, like how inconsistent they tasted. But the customer perspective, it's like, somebody buying coffee from a plant on the East Coast, that's what they're going to get. And that's what they're going to get this morning, tomorrow morning. That's what they had yesterday morning.
Right. How many customers are doing side-by-side comparisons, right?
Yeah,
like
nobody.
that's the thing.
Yeah.
I mean, don't say nobody, Marcus. There are probably
Right.
some customers
It's
that are full on doing side-by-side comparisons, but I would just say few, small.
a tiny fraction, but yeah, but there's also this idea, I guess, of like the wheelhouse effect, right? Like, are they close enough that like they have a general relationship to one another that even if somebody was tasting pretty closely side by side, is it like a total red flag difference? Or is it like, okay, like they're different, but it's still acceptable?
Right, margin of error, right? Building in margin of error, I think, is in thresholds of acceptability. I think from a QC process, again, I think that those are very important.
Yep, exactly. And it's, and that's the sort of idea, right? I mean, of course we want it to be delicious, but to come back to this quote, which I guess I really liked of yours, but Steve, it's like, is it the same or is it delicious? And what do those tests look like, right? I love this photo because it does show like, I mean, for one, it's like the nicest looking triangle test I've ever seen set up. I wish I had blocks in my cupping lab. but right, thinking about how you're setting up these tests to sort of assess, not just is it different, but what's that margin of error? And there's a lot of ways to go about it. This is maybe what takes us into the realm of like best practices versus the reality of operating a business. But right, I mean, this, we talked about this earlier and we're kind of just now coming to it, but it doesn't make sense to use the SCA cupping form for a production cupping, right? It's like you're asking a lot of questions. It takes a long time. It's a quite detailed analysis when all you're trying to do is sort of pass fail a coffee.
Right.
Whereas, you know, something like this is our 3-cat, like sort of simplified production cupping sheet where you just rate, you know, 3 very important attributes kind of from a meta scale on a scale of, you know, 1 to 3. And different roasters use this in different ways. You know, it could just be like, well, if it's a perfect match to what I expected, I'm going to assign it a 2. If it's worse, I'm going to move it closer to 1. And if it's improved, I'm going to move it closer to 3. You know, still helps you find happy accidents if it's an overall higher number. But it can be quite fast, you know, a little more rigorous than just passing or failing, but also a pass fail is fine. I like using this when I teach students, like just like in roasting classes, because it's just such like a quick and succinct way for them to like taste a coffee and think about how it's different. What does like a cupping sheet or like a cupping protocol look like for you all for a production style tasting?
Johannes, you want to go first? Sure.
Yeah. We actually used the SCA form also for production cupping because, yeah, I mean, we are a small roastery still. I think we roast 95 tons last year. So not the smallest one, but we are able to cup our production coffees with the SCA form because we don't have an QC team. We are all the same people here at the roastery. So quality control is me, 2 of our roasters, and maybe 1 or 2 other persons. We're trying to keep them always the same, to have a certain level of descriptions and tasting notes. But we are using the SCA form because it helps us to describe the coffee a little bit more into detail, maybe. And also when we get new crop, maybe we have to change the flavor descriptions on the bags, maybe. And we always get a ton of data which we can use after cupping.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. And that especially like, you know, one of the goals of the SCA cupping form is to like, how do they describe it in the Q class, right? It's to fully explore what a coffee has to offer. And it does that, right? Because it is easy to forget about an attribute like balance or an attribute like mouthfeel if you're not sort of guided through that whole process. So I love that. Yeah, and Steve, how about you? Both either at companies you've consulted with or larger companies you've worked for, or now at Linnea, what's the?
Yeah, I try to put it, I use kind of like this, like the simplified cupping forms. I think some of the larger companies, or even not necessarily that large companies, and maybe that was the problem, because you know, there were companies where we were roasting like 40 batches a day. Like I couldn't use the SCA form. Like my brain would explode. Yeah. So it's really just about a pass fail, like this works. And you know, the notes and the descriptors, I tend to sometimes be quite verbose. So like those are great for me to keep track of, like if I need to change the notes or whatever on the bag, or like making sure that, like, you know, again, maybe dating myself. So there was no like Cropster cup, you know, so it was like, I'm still used to writing things on paper. So most of my notes are in my head or written down, scrawled on paper. So that's sort of still the way that I think. And so it was just like pass fail. Yeah.
You know, like in my back pocket, because I can always write down cupping notes there, and then
exactly
of them that I never go back to. But when that was my main tool, I would frequently flip through them. It was,
yeah, same. I have like just scads and notebooks with like even before Cropster, like with time temperature graphs and like little like notebooks full of just like ridiculous, like, 1 minute, this degree. It's like
Yep.
a box of them just sitting
So many
around.
reams of graph paper with 30-second temperature readings and occasionally like a calculation of rate of rise. Just
Right.
I mean, I'm glad for the tools we have now, but I'm
I
also
am too.
trying to learn
So
how to
much.
roast.
There's also so much less paper that we're using, which is probably great for the environment. But yeah, I like the simplified form, and I tend to just write a bunch of notes. If there are changes that need to be made, I just also like input those in my head. I guess it's just sort of my version of the QC process, and I've kind of carried that throughout sort of all of my everywhere that I go. I kind of implement that, where like purchasing coffee and SCA is like very SCA heavy, and really, again, exploring everything that the coffee has to offer, and then really having a very strong idea once we go into production about how to basically get the thing in my head out of my head and into production, and then how to maintain that. And maintaining that is very simple for me, because it's just process wise. I don't want to make it too complex of a process if I'm not the only one implementing it. So, just try to make it where everybody that's working can also follow the process, and it takes a little bit of load off of you as like kind of the operator, where like you have these systems of checks and balances in place.
I mean, and you mentioned the people element, right? It does take a certain like element of training and getting people like to the point where they're familiar enough with the coffee or with the procedures. I always think back to we had a cup taster champion here in the US who was a cupper at Starbucks, and I talked to her about this and other folks that had worked at Starbucks over the years about their cuppings, and it was either like production batches, or it was even just like evaluating one container of Costa Rica versus another versus, some like 40 containers of Costa Rica for some blend component. And it was literally like 1 cup of each. And if there was any question about a cup and kind of how it deviated from what was expected, that cup was just pushed back. And at that point, that was like the trigger to take a more careful look at it. But, it's like that doesn't happen without some training and some familiarity and what it's like. But yeah, if you're cupping hundreds of coffees a day, like there's ways to still make this work.
And actually just the sheer volume of cupping and the exercising that muscle memory, that's super helpful. I think there's a reason potentially why, the woman from Starbucks won cup tasters. Is just the sheer volume of cupping and just having that step and repeat. And flexing those muscles every day on that level at that volume is just like, even it doesn't matter what quality you're cupping. Again, you're really looking again for difference and the ability to isolate and pick out difference. And again, from a consistency level, that is so important.
Right. Which that's exactly the purpose. If anybody who's taken their Q or taken most SCA courses, they are asked to do some sort of a triangle test or an in-out test, which is just, right, these all fall under this umbrella of like different from control, where, right, in the triangle test, in this case, in each of these groups, one of the cups would be different, right? So it would be like if I had 2 profiles where, let's just take Johannes as example, one had a much higher turning point. Well, if I really wanted to assess not just what that did to the cup, but is it sort of statistically significant in a way that customers will notice, well, I would just set it up, right? Like group 1 might be cup A is profile 1, group B is profile 1, group C is profile 2, and 2 might be 221 and 3, right? So, if I set up 6 groups and I've got 4, 5, 6 people cupping in my company, well, that's 36 data points to be able to sort of see when it's truly blind, when it's truly randomized, can I consistently pick out that odd cup? And, if the chance of guessing is 30%, you can apply a statistics table if you're sort of mathematically oriented, or you can just be like, well, 4 trained tasters in our company that know these coffees really well couldn't meaningfully pass this test. The coffee is fine. They take a little time to set up, but also like, they can be done with filter brewed coffee. Like they don't have to be cupped. It's
Mhm.
a pretty good stand-in. I
I think
honestly,
that's the other thing, Marcus, is I think removing bias, right? I think that's important to consistency in QC. Like no roaster wants to have messed up a batch of coffee. Like, it's like, so as you're QCing, just making sure that, again, like there's blind is always best, removing the bias, making it, when you're doing triangle tests, it's not like, oh, this is PR number so and so, like I nailed this roast, and you're like, yeah, this roast is delicious. You're like, no, dude, just
Yeah.
it's A.
and that's what like gets me, right? When I work with roasters and I ask them like, what do you do when something goes wrong? They're like, oh, we just cup the two coffees side by side. I'm like, well, that's great. Like you might be failing a lot of coffee based on that actually wouldn't fail, or you're missing the opportunity to like blend a passing batch and a failing batch and get it to the point where it passes. But I mean, I don't know a lot of roasters that employ triangle tests as kind of a normal course of doing business, but I don't know. Johannes, do you ever bring these into play? You're an SCA trainer and you're certainly familiar with testing students to this standard. Do you test your own coffees in your own team?
Yeah, sometimes we do blind test. When we are testing production cupping, we always do blind tasting because some guys here are also biased with some coffees, and might be not the coffee they like. It's not a bad coffee, but it's not their type of taste, and that's always I know that's coffee from India maybe, and that's not the coffee I like, and they always talking bad about it, even they haven't cupped it yet. But when you do blind tasting, you get the right answer from them if it's good or not good. And sometimes people are surprised that it is a coffee that they normally don't like. And in blind cupping, they understand that they have to decide a coffee just by its taste and not by its origin or something else.
I love it. I'm just putting a box together to send to a friend. It's samples that a friend of mine grew on a farm, sending them to a friend who buys coffee for a roaster. And I'm not telling the roaster where these coffees are from. I literally rebagged them and just put PG numbers on it from the Cropster account. And even in the Cropster account, there's like no information because it's an origin that I think many specialty folks would be a little bit suspect of.
Even the profile, though, what Johannes said is that's, those are super good points. Like for QC, right, and consistency, you don't have to like it. You just have to evaluate it. I mean, that's sort of like, that's the main point of consistency, right? Like you have a profile, like maybe you have a darker roast on your menu and your roasters or your QC team's not always super excited about it. It's like, we're not asking you to be excited about it. We're asking you whether it hits these parameters. That's the gig.
Yeah, exactly. Because, right, I mean, every one of our companies probably has coffees on our menu that we are less excited about and other coffees we're more excited about.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe as I get older, I get more excited about all the coffees, even if it's not the one I grab to take home. But yeah, being able to sort of eliminate that bias is super important.
Yeah.
What about, we've been talking a lot about QC tests and tasting and things, and our producer Hannes just chatted a question over to me. What about like other tools and how do they come in place with quality control? Like, are you using an Agtron for your coffee? Are you looking at sort of other technical characteristics of your coffee to determine?
I only use Cropster products for QC, nothing else. No.
Checks in the mail, Steve.
Checks in the mail. No, color meters are great. Again, data points. all of these things, right, are data points and they're all tools. And it is best not to be guided by the tool, but to utilize the tool in the way in which it was supposed to be used. So like Agtron is a great data point, but don't fail a coffee because like we were just talking about cupping, right? It's about what does it taste like and what's the measurable difference. If it's like a couple points off on Agtron, but there's no measurable difference on the cupping table in a triangle test, then like, I personally don't see a problem.
Yeah, I agree. And you know, it's one of the problems with the tools too, is that are folks truly using them as they're designed? You know, I've seen a lot of folks take color readings, but they take them at vastly different times off roast. Some batches, they take a color reading kind of right away, then they get busy. So other batches you don't get a color reading for hours after. Well, guess what? That color changes over time. So it's like finding the protocol and the proper way to use the tool.
Agtron was designed to measure the color reading of McDonald's French fries. So no one's using the tool for the way it was designed in the coffee industry, right? So there you go.
I think it's a good tool, but yeah, exactly. It's not the be all end all. It's ultimately it's what's in the cup.
Yeah. We also are measuring roast color, but we also figure that the number always changes when you change the grind size. Even when you change the grinder, we have two EK43 next to each other. And if you roast the same coffee after roast and you grind them, you measure the color, it says different readings just because you used another grinder. So I think that's the hardest part with measuring color, when you need that data point that you have, as you said, your protocol that you follow always like 20 minutes or half an hour after the roast. I do the color reading with the same grinder at the same grind size and do it always the same. And that's the only way you get
the data point, just like our profiles, right? It's like turning points at a different temperature, and that's interesting to know. The question is it important? And that's what you assess through the tasting, right?
Yep,
absolutely. Well, just, I mean, you know, I kind of, just with our remaining time, you know, we don't have too much time, but just a few minutes, you know, Johannes, if you can start us off just talking about it, Roastetrommel, a little bit about, like, practically, how do you put all this together? We've kind of been folding these questions in as we go, but if you just have any last kind of comments about it, and then Steve, I'll give you a chance too.
Yeah, I think we are just trying to give our best to monitor everything, every aspect that could change. But we also know that I think we can't nail every roast curve perfectly every time. I think our biggest goal is to maintain a certain standard. I mean, the customer is king, and if the customer is happy, we are happy. And yeah, we are trying our best. We use all those tools. We use the humidity of we measure the humidity of the coffee, the roast color. We use Cropster. We use Cropster cup, and trying to give our best to get as close to perfection as we can.
And so I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot here, and I grabbed the screenshot of a new Cropster feature, which brings in drum speed control, which to me it's always like, it's like the last thing that I ever mess with on a profile. It's like the most difficult to kind of wrap my head around. It really impacts like the readings from my thermocouples and all of this. But I know as you were like beta testing this and working with it, you had some really thoughtful comments about drum speed and how, like, why you would change it like in the middle of a profile, or why you would change it as you're scaling batch sizes. I wonder if you could just enlighten me a little bit. I'm still trying to figure this out.
Yeah, what we figured out is that if you have a perfect roast curve, you don't have to change drum speed at all. But with some coffees, like the more experimental coffees like carbonic maceration or anaerobic naturals, they don't behave as consistent over the roast as normal washed coffees do. So we figured that sometimes we can even out the roast curve or the rate of rise with changing the drum speed. And what we figured out is that if you have a big drop in the rate of rise after the first crack, you can change that with going up with the drum speed. If you change the drum speed to a higher speed, then what it does, it throws the coffee higher in the drum, and you have a little bit higher temperatures on top of the drum than on the bottom. So we figured that we can manipulate the rate of rise a little bit by changing the drum speed during the roast. And that was quite interesting for us. And we used Gießen roasters, and you always have to go into the menu and then into the other under menu to change the drum speed on the roaster. And with the Cropster and the drum speed control, you always have everything on screen. You can change it, and you also on roast repeat if you use that, and the Cropster does it by itself to the perfect time.
Cool, that's awesome. I'm gonna have to try that. I also roast on a Gießen, and I'll often use airspeed and air pressure to impact that. So I'm gonna have to do some trials with some of these coffees I have. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And Steve, how about just some kind of comments just to wrap us up and take us back to the practical level from Linea Coffee?
Yeah, what Johannes said, pretty much all of that. Just do that. Like, use all the tools, set up a program, use all the tools. I think, again, setting goals for me, roast goals and profiles. I think that's, if you're super busy from a practical standpoint, at least if you can't get to cupping every day, at least if there's a failed roast, it'll automatically flag and you can check those things out. But yeah, try to cup every day. Try to just set the profiles and standardize everything, before it goes to production, so that once you're in production, you can maintain, your illusion of consistency a lot more easily. Right.
No, that's great. Thank you. And I wish that we had like another half an hour, because I would love to dive in, like, how as roasters, you're like talking to the retail teams and adjusting recipes as coffees change. But I know that
you should never talk to the retail team as a roaster. We are roasters for a reason, is to be back of house, not front of house. That's parting words.
Back to the roasters field mugs that nobody else at SC they liked except for the roasters. No, that's great. Thank you both so much. And if any of our participants have any questions here as we're at the top of the hour, please ask them. Also, anybody who's here, if you'd like to see more about Cropster and learn more, you can always book a demo and set up a free trial if you're not currently a Cropster user. Or if you are and just want to learn more about your account, you can contact us here too. Just a minute if there's any questions. All right, it looks like crickets. So gentlemen, thank you so much to our
Thanks, Marcus.
Thank you. This has been recorded and will be posted on our YouTube page as well. So if anybody wants to come back, they can visit that again. Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.